A team of scientists just unsealed an Egyptian tomb that had been locked for nearly 2,000 years, and what they found pressed onto one of the mummies has left archaeologists genuinely stunned, because this is something they say has never been documented before in the entire history of the field. It was not gold, it was not jewels, it was a war story, a folded sheet of papyrus placed directly onto the chest and stomach of a dead man, and then sealed shut with the embalmer's own clay stamp, and on that papyrus, written in ancient Greek, were the words of the most famous war ever told, the fall of Troy. This is not an old find that someone dusted off. This was pulled from the sand in the last excavation season, analyzed by papyrologists in early 2026, and the results are so strange that the scientists who made the discovery are openly arguing about what it actually means. Because here is the question none of them can answer. Why would Egyptian embalmers take a Greek poem about a war fought 1,000 miles away and bury it on a man's body, as if those words were something he would need after death? Mainstream history has a clean, simple story about how the ancient dead were buried, the spells, the prayers, the gods, all of it cataloged in museums, all of it supposedly settled. But this single mummy just tore a hole in that story. And what is showing through that hole is something the textbooks never prepared anyone for. So who was this man? What is the science actually telling us? And what were they really trying to do to him? Stay with me, because the evidence at the end points to something far more deliberate than anyone first believed. To understand why specialists are calling this exceptional, you have to understand where it came from. There is a site in Egypt, about 118 miles south of Cairo, resting beside an old channel of the Nile. The ancient Greeks named it Oxyrhynchus, after a sacred fish. Today it is called Al-Bahnasa, and from the surface, it looks like nothing, sand and broken stone, silence. But scientifically, this is one of the most important archaeological sites on the entire planet. For over a century, excavations here have recovered more than 500,000 fragments of ancient writing. That is not an exaggeration. That is the documented count. Lost Gospels, plays by Sophocles that vanished from history, poems by Sappho the world believed were gone forever. This is the single richest source of ancient text ever discovered, and it is still producing. So, in the most recent campaign, a research team from the University of Barcelona, working under official agreement with Egypt's Antiquities authorities, returned to dig. They expected documents, maybe some tombs. What they were not prepared for was a body that would force them to question their own rulebook. Their dig opened a sealed complex, 3 chambers cut from limestone, and the moment they got inside, the evidence told them they were not the first ones there. Centuries ago, ancient tomb robbers had broken in, the painted wooden coffins were smashed, the valuables stripped clean. But here is the detail that matters. The looters left certain things behind, not because they missed them, but because to a thief, those things had no resale value at all. And that is exactly what scientists have been waiting 2,000 years to study. The objects a grave robber throws aside are often the objects that carry the real information. Gold can be melted and sold, but a sealed papyrus tells you how these people actually thought inside a burial labeled Tomb 65. They found him, a mummified adult male, wrapped in the layered style of Roman-era Egypt, a period when the pharaohs were already ancient history, and Egypt was a province of Rome. But it was not the body that stopped them. It was what was lying on top of it. Now, here's a correction that matters, and it shows you how carefully real science works. Early reports claimed the papyrus was found inside the mummy's body, but the specialists at the University of Hamburg, who study these exact materials, formally corrected that. The papyrus was not stuffed inside. It was placed on top of the body, deliberately covering the abdomen and chest, then folded, and sealed with a clay device. Some of those seals at this site even carry tiny hieroglyphic marks, identifying them as the embalmer's own seals. Think about what that proves. This was not random. This was not filler. Someone, during the funeral ritual, selected this papyrus, positioned it precisely over the man's heart, and locked it onto him on purpose. When conservators examined the fragile fragment under digital microscopes and infrared imaging, the language came back as ancient Greek, and when the papyrologist read the surviving lines, the room went quiet, because these were not magic spells. These were not Egyptian prayers. These were verses from Homer's Iliad, the legendary poem of the Trojan War, and the specific section makes it even stranger. The text comes from Book 2 of the Iliad, a passage scholars call the Catalogue of Ships. To a modern ear, it sounds dull. It is essentially a list, naming the Greek commanders and how many ships each one brought to attack Troy. But the surviving words on this mummy still name them. A warrior called Gunius, arriving with 22 ships, and Tlepolemus, described as the son of Hercules, a man both brave and of great stature, sailing in with 9 ships from Rhodes. For the ancient Greeks, this passage was not boring. It was sacred. It was the roll call of heroes, the breath before the greatest war in their entire mythology. It tied every Greek who heard it back to a shared origin, a common bloodline, a story they all belonged to. And someone decided that this dead man in Egypt needed to carry those exact heroes into the next world. Here is why the science makes this so hard to dismiss. Papyrus was expensive. Ancient people reused it constantly, scraping off old writing to reuse the sheet. So the easy explanation would be, this was just scrap paper. But that explanation collapses under the evidence. Scrap paper is not folded with care. It is not positioned over the heart. And it is not sealed with the embalmer's official stamp. Every physical detail says the same thing. This was chosen. The team that found it made a powerful claim. They announced it as the first time in the history of archaeology that a Greek work of literature was deliberately built into the mummification ritual itself. And this is where the story splits open, because a papyrologist from the University of Bologna, Roberta Mazza, pushed back. She pointed to something that happened in 1888. Over 100 years ago, the archaeologist Flinders Petrie was digging in the Fayum region of Egypt. And there, he found a papyrus roll tucked beneath the head of a mummified woman. And that roll contained almost the entire Book 2 of the Iliad. The same book, the same catalogue of ships. That mummy scroll has been sitting in Oxford's Bodleian Library ever since. So was the 2026 discovery truly a first, or part of a hidden pattern that history quietly forgot? This is the part that mainstream coverage glosses over. And it is where the real truth lives, the older find. Was a personal scroll, likely a possession buried with its owner, but the new discovery is mechanically different. This papyrus was folded, sealed with the embalmer's own clay mark, and made a working part of the embalming process itself. Not a keepsake. A tool, something the dead body was meant to use. Mazza also made a sharper point, one worth remembering. She noted that the pressure to publicize finds, to attract funding, shapes how discoveries get announced. In other words, sometimes the word first is doing marketing, not science. And knowing that is exactly the kind of inside knowledge that separates someone who understands archaeology from someone who just reads headlines. But it still leaves the real question standing. What was the Iliad supposed to do for him? To answer that, the scientists looked at what else was buried in the same necropolis, and the pattern that emerged is chilling. Across this site, mummy after mummy was found with something glinting inside the mouth, tongues made of gold, thin sheets of precious metal, shaped like a tongue, and laid over the mouths of the dead. In this work alone, they recovered 3 gold tongues, and 1 made of copper. And earlier seasons at the same site produced even more. This is not decoration, and the reasoning behind it is pure ancient belief. The Egyptians held that to enter the afterlife, the dead had to speak. They had to stand before Osiris, god of the underworld, and defend their entire life out loud. But a tongue of decayed flesh could not do that, so they replaced it with a tongue of gold, because gold was considered the flesh of the gods, incorruptible, eternal. A mouth that could speak forever. Now connect the 2 facts. A tongue of gold, so the dead could speak, and a poem of war sealed over the chest, so the dead could carry words. These are not random objects thrown into a grave. Every single one is engineered around the same idea, giving the dead exactly what they would need for the journey ahead. And then there were the jars. In one limestone chamber, the team found a large sealed jar. Inside it, the cremated remains of an adult, the bones of an infant, and the head of a cat, all wrapped together in cloth. In a second chamber, another jar, holding 2 cremated people. And again, animal bones from the same species. Sit with how strange that is. These were people cremating their dead and burying them with animals. In the one civilization on Earth that had spent thousands of years perfecting mummification instead, this is 2 entire belief systems, Egyptian and Greco-Roman, colliding inside a single tomb. This was a society standing between 2 worlds, and that collision may be the key to the entire mystery. So let's return to the question that opened all of this. Why bury a war poem with a dead man? The researchers have 3 serious theories, and each one is backed by real evidence. The first is that the papyrus was a signature, the mark of the embalmer who prepared the body. But even the lead researcher admits this feels strange. Why sign your work with the catalogue of ships? The second is protection. Other sealed papyri from this exact site contain magical formulas. spells meant to guard the dead in the afterlife, and here is the evidence that supports it. Ancient written prescriptions describe using Homer as actual medicine. In one surviving formula, a person burning with fever was instructed to press their head against a scroll of the Iliad to break the fever. To these people, the words of Homer were not just art. They were believed to hold physical power. The third theory is the most human. Maybe this man or his family simply loved Homer, or maybe in a land ruled by foreign powers, carrying a Greek poem was a way of claiming an identity, a way of saying, let me into a Greek afterlife, treat me as one of these heroes, a passport, written in the language of war to get past the gods at the gate. And here is the most honest part. The part that proves this is real science and not invention. The researchers admit they do not know for certain. The papyrus is fragile and degraded, and they have refused to tear it apart to read more of it. Instead, they are preparing to use advanced imaging, X-rays, and infrared scanning, the same principles used in hospital machines, to read the hidden words without ever physically touching the document. And this is the detail almost no one is talking about. There are still sealed papyrus packets from this site that have never been opened, folded, stamped, waiting in the dark, and the scientists are deliberately choosing not to break them open. They plan to scan them with medical-grade imaging to see what is written inside, without destroying a single fiber, which means the biggest revelation may not have happened yet. The answer could be sitting, sealed, in a laboratory right now, waiting for a scan that finally lets us read words no living human has seen in 2,000 years. So, what does all of this really tell us? For generations, we pictured the ancient dead buried with treasure and prayers to forgotten gods, but this single mummy, pulled from the Egyptian sand, reveals something far more intimate and far more unsettling. These were people standing at the border of two civilizations, reaching for anything they believed might carry them safely into eternity. A tongue of gold to speak, a poem of heroes to protect, a foreign god's story, folded against the heart. They were not so different from us, afraid of the dark, hoping the right words might be enough to survive it. And the man in Tomb 65, whoever he was, took his answer with him, the War of Troy, sealed over his chest, carried into a silence that lasted nearly 2,000 years, until a research team brushed away the dust and asked the one question he can no longer answer. We may never fully prove why the Iliad was buried with him, but the evidence makes one thing undeniable. In the ancient world, a story was not just something you read. A story was something you could take with you, even into death. And tonight, in an Egyptian laboratory, sealed papyri are still waiting, holding words no living person has read in 20 centuries. The moment one of them is finally scanned, this story could change all over again. If hidden history like this, the kind that mainstream coverage almost completely skipped over, is what you want to keep uncovering, then subscribe and turn on notifications, so the next discovery reaches you the instant it surfaces. And drop your theory in the comments. Why do you think they sealed a war poem onto the dead? I read every single one, until the next discovery. Keep questioning what they told you was already settled, because the sand is still giving up its secrets.